Before we get into the episode, a quick reminder that this podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only, and nothing should be construed as investment or legal advice. Now for a word from Onramp. Onramp is a Bitcoin asset management platform built on multi-institution custody. Leveraging our partnerships with industry veterans BitGo and CoinCover, Onramp's multi-institution custody is a segregated vault, requiring 2 of 3 institutions at any point in time to sign once a client's unique permissions have been met. Our industry-leading best-in-class approach to custody helps individuals and institutions secure new and existing Bitcoin positions. All keys are held in deep cold storage and kept 100% offline, managed with institutional-grade security best practices. The custody solution eliminates single points of failure and reduces counterparty risks, ensuring maximum security and peace of mind. Onramp's suite of products includes our custody offering, a spot Bitcoin fund, private wealth services and inheritance planning, and managed wealth for advisors. Whether you're new to Bitcoin or a veteran in the space, we would love to connect with you to understand your needs and how we can serve you. Please visit our website at onrampbitcoin.com, where you can schedule a consultation and connect directly with our team.
It all comes down to computers communicating.
The information superhighway can be a confusing mix of on-ramps and off-ramps.
Bitcoin is worthless artificial gold.
Is it still rat poison?
Probably rat poison squared.
We need to get into the world of, okay, this is actually foundational technology.
What the Internet of Money does is it creates a single network which can do a microtransaction to a gigatransaction.
The Internet is going to be one of the major forces for reducing the role of government. The one thing that's missing, but that will soon be developed, is a reliable e-cash.
And we are live. Welcome to the first episode of Final Settlement. This is a new podcast coming from the Onramp Media umbrella. You might be familiar with The Last Trade, the podcast that we started in May of last year. We are expanding the suite of podcasts here at Onramp, building some complementary shows that will look at Bitcoin at, from a bit of a different lens than what The Last Trade has historically been, which is primarily the intersection of Bitcoin and traditional finance, the global macro context, and really Bitcoin as a financial instrument. The purpose of Final Settlement is really to go beyond the digital gold thesis and really look at Bitcoin as a piece of technology and understand the protocol layer and the various forms of utility that are being leveraged in the real world. People building on top of Bitcoin and using this open source protocol to better society in various ways. And so this podcast is going to be every 2 weeks, and you'll still get The Last Trade every Friday, so no worries there. But really just trying to build a more comprehensive approach to education generally, and really helping investors and our audience build their thesis on Bitcoin beyond just Bitcoin as a financial instrument or a number on a screen. There's a lot more meat to cover as you go down the rabbit hole. So that'll be sort of the goal of the show. My name is Brian Cubellis. I'm the head of strategy and research here at Onramp. Co-hosting Final Settlement with me will be Michael Tanguma, co-founder and CEO of Onramp, and our first guest, Mr. Matt Odell. Super pumped to have you on. Could think of no one better to start this podcast than Matt. He's been, contributing to the Bitcoin space for several years in a number of ways, wears many hats. But Matt, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, I literally wear many hats. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it. It's almost become a joke, like, oh, what do we need another Bitcoin podcast? But the more education, the better. It's an important topic.
Absolutely.
I'm just glad Matt's our first, because we can say, we were talking about when do we get him on The Last Trade, and now we could say we started a whole podcast to have Matt on.
We were waiting.
Still
haven't invited me on The Last Trade.
This is even better. It's a whole brand new pod, first episode. We will find.
I accidentally joined the tail end of one of them, but
that's right. That's true.
I technically was not a guest.
I thought about it around the ETF when the ETF gets announced, so you can scream at everyone about how it's not Bitcoin. But I don't know if that'd be appropriate for that audience. But maybe we'll fix it.
Well, it's funny on the ETF side. I mean, I know we're not supposed to talk about this is like a last trade topic, but I mean, it's just funny on the ETF side that my role has almost been the opposite. You know, the ETF is not Bitcoin; it's an IOU. You should learn how to hold your own Bitcoin. You should learn how to use it as freedom money. But the ETFs are incredibly bullish. Like they will increase the purchasing power of Bitcoin tremendously by exposing it to a new market. And also, all these companies can do it without permission. That's the whole point of Bitcoin. So I think, the ETFs aren't priced in. I think it's impossible for them to be priced in because the suits can't hold their own private keys. They lack the personal responsibility and the chops to do it. So they need a new custodial wallet product in order to get exposure to Bitcoin, and that's what the ETFs are. They're simply just a custodial wallet for suits.
And it also just sort of amplifies what we always think about, which is like education and really awareness are what tips the scales of adoption over the long term, right? And so whether it's an inferior product or not, like it'll force people to think about Bitcoin more so than they previously would have once these things exist. But so have a bunch of things I want to get to. But Matt, I'm curious, I personally have learned a ton from you over the years on RHR, Citadel Dispatch, thousands of hours of pods. But I don't think I can recall like your actual Bitcoin origin story. Like what were you doing before Bitcoin? Did you have any sort of like predispositions or past experiences that led you to find Bitcoin and dig deeper? Or I'm just curious, what was that origin story like and what stood out to you and caused you to think more deeply about it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really talk about my previous professional fiat life much. But the TLDR, the quick summary is that I was a, disenfranchised youth. I didn't have much hope. Like I grew up through the 2008 financial collapse. I saw that there were no adults in the room. No one had any idea what was going on, but everyone just acts super confident on CNBC while they're just fucking YOLOing it and winging it. And then I was like, okay, so you can't trust the banks, but at least we got the tech companies. Like, Google's "Don't do evil" is their slogan. Like, of course they got our back. And then Snowden came out in 2013. And Snowden was like, all the major tech companies are complicit in mass surveillance and control. And at that point, I discovered Bitcoin I discovered Bitcoin right before Snowden's leaks. So it was this culmination of you can't trust the financial system, you can't trust big tech. So what is the solution? The solution is free and open source software. It's freedom tech. And Bitcoin fits squarely in that hole.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I think that's part of the reason I think you're the perfect first guest for the show, because you actually did come at it first from a technology perspective. Whereas I think, there is a proclivity, at least in sort of the institutional realm, the traditional finance world, and even just sort of casual onlookers of Bitcoin, to think of it first and foremost as just another asset, similar to a stock or a bond or other precious metal, and not really think of it as a technology first. And so I think, from a very high level, like, a fundamental perspective, most people don't even know, that there is a distinction between Bitcoin, the asset, and Bitcoin, the network, right? And so it's fascinating that you came at it first from a network perspective. But I think the reality is most people are coming at it from an asset perspective, which is fine. The digital gold thesis is important. But I think in order to sort of strengthen people's conviction over time, you need to understand this more fully in a more comprehensive level and understand that this is an open source piece of software. And I think, that's something that you've spent a lot of time thinking about. And I'm curious your thoughts just around, why is it so important and critical that Bitcoin is built on this foundation of free and open source software? And how does that what are the implications of that, generally speaking? And why does that make it very different? Why does that make the asset that is governed by the protocol much different than any other assets that someone could invest in?
I mean, the open source software is a foundational building block that this is all built on top of. Because the problem isn't a technical problem. The problem is a human problem. The issue we face in society is that all of our institutions require insane amounts of trust in centralized entities, individuals, companies, governments, and those entities inevitably get corrupted. It doesn't matter, how good of a person you are or how well-meaning you are at first. Like, if you get big enough and you become the juggernaut that Google is, it doesn't even matter if you want to be evil. You have no choice. You get a gun pointed to your head and you're forced to do it. So the beauty of open source software is that it is at its core not controlled by an entity. It's not controlled by an individual. It's free and available to the public. They can modify it. They can ship it. They can monetize it. They can do whatever the hell they want to do with it without permission. So open source software is absolutely beautiful in that regard. It's almost viral in nature, where you don't, the person who created the software could die. I mean, we have no idea who Satoshi is. He completely disappeared. And people can take where he left off and continue on. You can throw someone in jail for being an open source contributor, which is absolutely insane, particularly in America, where we have, at least we're supposed to have constitutional protections on free speech. But it doesn't matter if you throw the lead developer in jail, because the software is code and it's available to everybody. So that's key. That's key to this whole mission, this whole movement, and it's key to every Bitcoin holder, because at the end of the day, you can't have wealth without freedom. If it requires someone's permission to spend your Bitcoin, then it's not your Bitcoin, because they can stop you from spending it at will. They can seize your money at will. It defeats the whole entire purpose of the thing. So I think there's a bit of a disconnect right now, where people think that they can be separated, that this idea of store of value or Bitcoin as a financial asset is different than Bitcoin as P2P cash. And it's just not the case, because it doesn't matter what price Bitcoin goes to. If you have to go ask BlackRock's permission to spend it, then you fucked up the whole thing. Like BlackRock doesn't have to be evil. They can literally just have a gun pointed to their head and say, Michael can't spend his Bitcoin. Stop him from spending it. He's on the terrorist watch list. Boom, done.
Yeah. No, it's a really good point, because I think, from that perspective, it's like that's really the core value prop of this thing, right? Like, yes, the scarcity, the immutability are important, but it is the fact that it is this open network that is accessible to everyone and uncensorable. And I think we need to get to the point where people are building a more comprehensive thesis on this thing outside of number go up. This is I have exposure to this thing that is going up in value. It's much more than that. And I'm curious, I think there's also some issue related to sort of, the notion of something being truly open source and permissionless. That sort of lends itself not only to a system being more robust and resilient, but also, maintaining some elements of true decentralization. And I sort of hate the word decentralization because it's wildly overused, and particularly in the crypto space, where the broader digital asset space, where, it's really, decentralized in name and marketing only. So I'm curious your thoughts around, what about Bitcoin and its foundations from a network perspective make it truly decentralized and allow it to remain so over time versus, some of these other quote unquote protocols that market themselves as decentralized, but may not be so.
Well, personally, I like the term distributed protocol. But either way, we're talking about the same thing. The idea that no individual or entity has control over Bitcoin and can change Bitcoin, which ironically has been considered by the quote unquote crypto people, and the overwhelming majority part of this industry has considered it a negative with Bitcoin, that it's hard to change by default, that there's not a centralized entity in control. But that is the key value prop. The key value prop is that it's incredibly difficult to change. And that is very rare in terms of digital tools, digital services. Usually it's the opposite, right? Where Tim Apple can just issue an update and everyone just updates. So it's fundamentally different in that respect, that it's not controlled. But yeah, it's a little bit interesting because it's hard to objectively measure distribution or decentralization. You really don't know until it's too late. Like it's very easy to tell when something is too centralized because it gets stomped on, right? A gun gets put to someone's head and something gets changed, someone gets rugged. But usually the majority of people don't realize that till after the fact. So one of the things I always say to Bitcoin, particularly less technical people, right? Like if you're technical, you can look at the code, you can look at all the different Git commits and see how the project has changed over time and do your own verification and analysis. And that's one of the beauties of open source software, is that you can see everything that's happening and you can verify it yourself. But if you're not technical, the single easiest way to solve this problem is time, right? And the number one thing you'll hear a non-technical person say is, oh, well, you say there's only 21 million Bitcoin, but humans always make promises they don't keep. There's no way they're going to keep the 21 million cap. Okay, well, I'm pretty sure the way Bitcoin is set up, that 21 million cap will never get fucking changed. It is not going to fucking happen. But if you don't have the capability of doing that, then time solves that for you. With time comes the ability to assess this in a more personal way, right? If you're watching Bitcoin for 5 years, 6 years, and the 21 million cap doesn't change, it's way less likely that it'll change in the next 5 years. You watch it for 10 years, it's way less likely it's going to change in the next 10 years. So for most people, it's going to take time to realize that the way this system was designed, it was designed to be incredibly resistant to change. But the core thing that I would like listeners to take away from this is that is the value prop. Because if you can change something easily, you can change it for the worse easily. And it's important that if we are building the bedrock of a global censorship-resistant, permissionless financial system, that it has the stability of not being manipulated super easily. Right. And that most people, that flies right over their head. That's the key. The key value prop is the thing that holds it all together is that you essentially need a overwhelming majority of individual stakeholders of Bitcoin. This is not a vote. This is no votes happening to agree with any kind of substantial change. And that just doesn't happen in practice unless there's massive motivation for something to happen. And something like the 21 million cap is a perfect example of the stakeholders it's against their financial interests to dilute the supply of their own, of the own asset that they potentially own significant amounts of.
I find the technology aspect interesting because it keeps people away from the asset in two different completely opposite spectrums. Like, and we can start with either one first, like for gold individuals or individuals that need to touch things. The technical aspect, you have all the concepts or primitives of gold without the physical nature. And then on the other side of it, you have all the aspects of gold, except for it's not fast enough or it doesn't do what it is for the tech side. So both sides of the camps are the ones that like can never look at it and they're like, this is too slow or this isn't fast enough, versus like it has this like natural sweet spot, and it just like continues. And I don't know what that lens of the world is that somebody looks at it and they look at it and they're like, okay, this makes sense. But we all see this and we have discussions, and it's like whether it's the touch points or the adoption phases, everybody slowly starts to realize, oh, this was exactly how it was supposed to be. It's just there just enough, right? These private keys live in the real world, so you can actually make a tangible aspect to it. And it also has speed, and you can talk about multiple layers that start to play into how you can compete with all the other cryptocurrencies. But at the same time, it doesn't fit in the bucket that everybody naturally wants it to fit in. And that's why it's so hard for individuals to accept or like wrap their heads around it, because it just doesn't map to the real world, all the way down to like what Matt alluded to in the like natural order of Facebook and Google. It doesn't wrap in a bow of like you have an owner, you have somebody that can just turn it off and like you can call. And so we're still trying to figure out how do we actually like get these primitives to individuals. And that's where like pods like this exist to be able to like figure out what are the mental models to get people to understand it, figure out how to build and invest.
Yeah. And it's a good point around, this sort of extreme resistance to change is very unique in the broader technology space, software space. And I think that's part of the disconnect between Bitcoin and all these other altcoin protocols, is that they're optimizing for different things, right? Like if you're building a new form of money, it should be resistant to change, right? You want to have a transparent and knowable monetary policy for that new form of money. All these other things, sometimes they market themselves as ultrasound money, but like the reality is that they're optimizing for other things, right? On the base layer in most instances. And so you can optimize for those things in Bitcoin, as Michael alluded to, but it happens above the base layer. And we can get into that more later in the convo. But I guess one sort of more high level question, and we don't have to get too in the weeds of it, but you sort of alluded to this, Matt, in terms of like how things actually do change on Bitcoin, because I think that generally speaking, that's like, again, such a foreign concept to people. It's like, oh, you're telling me this thing that is super scarce will never change, but actually technically anyone can change it. So it is hard for people to grasp that can be the reality. So maybe just some color on like, how do changes actually get made in Bitcoin? What are some things that, past examples that everyone was on board with that we're able to get through, and some opposite examples as well.
So, I mean, when you're talking about Bitcoin changes, right? Bitcoin, at the core, Bitcoin is a piece of software that people are running on their computers, right? First things first, there's no auto updates. So auto updates are a security hole. If a single developer somewhere has access to the ability to auto update people, they can auto update them to a malicious piece of software. So the number one core protection is if you want to change, like if you want to run a change to Bitcoin, you have to go manually install the new version of the software and install it on your computer. The second thing to keep in mind is there's two different baskets of changes, right? One is consensus level code. So this is the rules that each Bitcoin node, when you're running the a Bitcoin node is simply just running Bitcoin software on your computer. These Bitcoin nodes, their main role is to enforce the rules of the network. Any of those rules, we consider those consensus rules. Those are consensus changes. So what does that mean? So your node is, by running your own node, you're verifying the rules of the network on your own. And you're also able to broadcast to the network without permission, and you're able to verify all receipts, right? So if you're running a Bitcoin node, it's almost like you're running a gold bar verification service, right? Where every time you receive gold, it's automatically verified that gold is not counterfeit. Which is why it's incredibly important that people can easily run their own nodes, and people should use their own nodes if they are technically capable of it. It's way easier than people think it is. But the most important thing is that it's easy and accessible for people to do it, not necessarily that everyone does it. We're realistic. Everyone's not going to do it. But if enough people are doing it, then it makes it resistant. So on the consensus change side, anyone can take Bitcoin code. They can take the Bitcoin software. They can change it however the hell they want without permission. No one can stop them. If they change something on the consensus level, and then they run that software, the other Bitcoin nodes will reject them. They're essentially on a different version of Bitcoin. So consensus level changes are incredibly difficult to implement at scale, because you need buy-in from the other people that are running nodes. The thousands of people around the world running nodes all need to update to the new software. Otherwise, you're running on your own, essentially counterfeit Bitcoin network, right? Where no one's deeming those Bitcoin valid Bitcoin because it does not agree with their node's rules. And then you have non-consensus changes, and non-consensus changes can deal with stuff like mempool policy in terms of Bitcoin weight, like the waiting list to get into Bitcoin blocks, stuff like that. Those changes you can just implement on the fly. You can run it on your own node, and the other nodes will still communicate with you, but you might have a slightly different view of the network, or maybe you have a different interface on how you interact with the network, different kind of user-facing things that don't affect the rest of the network. But if they affect the rest of the network, we consider those consensus changes, and those are way, 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 way more difficult to get through. And the activation method for those kind of things is not very clear-cut. They've been activated in many different ways. Sometimes, in the early days, a lot of times it was like, oh, if the miners hit a certain threshold, then we'll do it. And it's gotten significantly harder over time. In 2017, a large portion of the miners decided they wanted to attack the network and try and push forward their own consensus change. And as a result, a lot of those activation methods have changed. And the only real major activation on the consensus level we've had since then is Taproot. And it happened to be relatively uncontroversial, and it kind of just got pushed through. But I don't expect other activations to happen that way. It's more of an art than a science. Also, you don't really, on the consensus level, you don't really know if you've hit the, this ridiculous threshold of like 95% plus. You don't really know until afterwards if you hit it. So everything is about trying to reduce any kind of user risk in that scenario. If you have a consensus change that, like, let's say half the network decides to go one way and half the network doesn't, you have something called a fork. And what that means is your blockchain, right? The Bitcoin blockchain that holds all of the record of all of our transactions publicly forever, right? It'll have a shared history, but when that consensus change happens, the history will fork. And from that point forward, it will have a different ledger, right? A different path forward. So if a fork does happen, which we had one, that was a minor fork in 2017, Bitcoin Cash, that relatively quickly resolved itself because most of the market was on the main chain of Bitcoin, and a subset of the market was on Bitcoin Cash. But if you have a fork in that situation, an existing holder essentially has the equivalent amount of Bitcoin on both sides. So the beauty of that, and I think not enough people appreciate that, the beauty of that is if someone were to a malicious actor was going to try and force through some kind of consensus change and got like 40% of the network or 60% of the network to go along with it, the average person could do nothing. And whichever chain turned out to dominate, they would still have the equivalent amount on it. Now, if you want to be a gambler, you can go onto the markets and you can sell one side for the other side. And all of it, that's the beauty of free markets, right? And the markets kind of price in which side is better, or which side has more market demand, I guess. And it kind of just works itself out. But if you're the average user, you can just sit there and do nothing and you get equivalent. Now, this is really important, though, in the age of ETFs, is if you're using a custodial wallet or an ETF, which is just a fancy custodial wallet for suits, you are trusting the custodian with that decision. Right. You have no choice on the matter. But if you're holding self-custody Bitcoin, you're holding your keys yourself. Maybe you're using a hardware wallet. Maybe you're using collaborative multisig. At that point, you're getting equivalent of both sides, and you can choose. Now, because of the messiness of consensus change, potential consensus change forks, what we normally see in Bitcoin in terms of these changes is something called a soft fork versus a hard fork. And with a soft fork, what happens is new clients might see the new thing. If you're running a new version of Bitcoin, you might see the new thing. But if you're running an old version of Bitcoin, it still works. It's still compatible with everything else. And it just is missing a subset of transactions. It just doesn't see the new shit. But you can still run the old one and be completely fine, and everything will still work together. And then a hard fork is everyone actually needs to update to the newest software. So hard forks are incredibly unlikely. Soft forks are a lot more likely. But both types of changes, when it comes to changing actual consensus rules of the network, the rules that these nodes enforce, are very, very rare and very, very difficult. And it's a combination of like art, politics, and just like sheer momentum. Like the only way you really have these changes, especially going forward, is if there is incredibly strong motivation among participants to enact this change. And that is basically this beautiful check we have on changes on Bitcoin, is that it needs to have like an absolute massive amount of demand for that change to actually happen.
So that was an incredible recap. I think I want to appreciate you running through that, because I think that's going to go down as we push people back to listening to understanding the fork. But so to go a little deeper on that, going backwards, for anybody that's not familiar, this is really where credible monetary policy comes into play. And Ethereum had the parity hack in, was it 14?
Yeah, 14, something like that.
14 or 15, where they rolled back the chain and forked to roll back from the hack. Versus,
well, it wasn't just the parity; they had the DAO hack too.
The DAO, yeah, right. It's the DAO, yeah.
I think parity. They said "fuck you" to parity and didn't roll back parity, but they rolled back DAO.
It was a DAO hack that they rolled back, effectively, moving the coins back into the existing wallet. Which
the hacker stole Ethereum and then they forked it. They did a hard fork. So consensus breaking change. Everyone had to update to the new software, and the new software stated that the hacker did not actually own the Ethereum, and it returned it back to the previous owners. And then at that point, there was the existing chain where the hacker still had it. They called it Ethereum Classic, and you had like this little glimpse into how you would market a malicious fork, right? Where you have the fork retain the name Ethereum, and then you have the one that wasn't the fork, that was the existing chain, you call that Classic, and you kind of just throw it under the bus.
And I think that's important to point out, one, because of monetary policy, it's not just a name only. When you think about decentralization, that was obviously not decentralized or distributed properly if you can roll that back. And it reminds me of whatever happened with CZ initially with the Safu, and he like referenced that he could roll back the chain, and they're like, oh yeah, try it. It's like this idea you can say it, but to be able to effectively do it on the Bitcoin protocol.
Yeah, CZ of Binance had some Bitcoin hacked, and he like tried to play games, and he couldn't get it back. Right? Final settlement. Name of the podcast. It comes down to the fact that a centralized entity does not have control. Right? All this stuff comes back to that. And Brian mentioned earlier, I think a better, more recent example, because it's easy for people. The old examples people always just brush under. Right? Like I was telling people don't like custodial risk is a real thing, not your keys, not your coins. And people were calling me a fudder, right? They were like, Mt. Gox was 10 years ago. That's ridiculous. Why do you hate people? Like my family relies on the yield I get from BlockFi and FTX and Celsius. And they all got fucking rugged, right? And now they have a new lesson on why they should hold self-custody and learn how to hold Bitcoin themselves. But in 10 years, like if there's not another major rug, like people are going to say the same thing, like, oh, FTX was a decade ago, like BlackRock is responsible now, and then BlackRock rugs, and then people will realize again. So the older examples are unfortunately, a little bit less effective, but we have a new example with Ethereum, which is this idea of ultrasound money, that they like 10 people in a room decided they were going to change the inflation rate of Ethereum, and then they changed it to be less than Bitcoin, and they were like, oh, we're a better store of value than Bitcoin, but they don't realize the cell phone that if they can change the monetary supply at a whim, they can change it in the opposite direction, and that's why it's not ultrasound, right?
Right.
You can't have a sound protocol, you can't have a hard protocol, you can't have a protocol that is censorship resistant and permissionless if there are centralized entities in control, because they can change it at will.
So real quick, because I know Brian wants to transition, but it's an important facet. I kind of want to put you on the spot, Matt, on to be most relevant, the ETF. So if we're realistic, I think we look at 3, 5, 10 year time frame. That is a realistic vector where we can think about forks and what happens. And I think there's two components. Matt alluded to one. Most investors coming in don't necessarily know Bitcoin is a digital bearer asset at the end of the day, and that you can actually take delivery of that. And independent, if you're not ready to take delivery right off the bat, you always want that optionality. And we've seen that with GBTC. And that's effectively what I think all agree here is going to happen, where if somebody wakes up, gets educated, and they're like, hey, I want my Bitcoin. Like, oh yeah, screw off. You can maybe get your dollars at best.
And
So
pay
then
cap gains.
Yeah, and pay cap gains. So then taking that to the dominant chain and working out how, like, because I'm actually generally curious on like, and I know it's more of science than art, or more of art than science, but with the Bcash fork, was the general consensus that most that were forking for Bcash like sold their Bitcoin, or did they hedge? And then how did that chain work out from like hash rate? Like, help us walk through that, and then what that would potentially look like, if you can, with like the ETF, because that would be a similar format for like green coin or whatever that would look like from a just game theory perspective of you have enough ETFs that are all saying, hey, this isn't like, conducive to ESG anymore. That's been discussed. It's part of these, S1 docs when it comes to like chains and consensus and who ultimately bears the responsibility or ability to determine which chain is dominant. So just like help us walk through what happened with Bcash and then where you could see that, or how it would play out. Not how it would play out, but effectively like what the vector would be with an ETF like this.
I believe there was a book. There was a book by the guy behind BitMEX Research.
Block size war?
The block size war, yep. Which everyone, if you're new to Bitcoin, you should read because it was crazy time. And it goes into everything, and he does a really good job of capturing all the different perspectives. And it's important because humans, it's a human thing, right? Winners write history. I think he did a very ethical job of being a winner writing that history, and I think it does capture as much of the other perspective as possible in an objective way. But anyway, with Bcash, it was a very interesting scenario. First of all, we were very immature in terms of Bitcoin as a network. We were very, very early on, and what was the result of that? The result was Bitmain, Chinese mining ASIC manufacturer. They make the mining computers, number one manufacturer in the world. Had almost no competition at the time. They were making 80% plus of mining ASICs. Also, a lot of those ASICs were mining in China, and they had the largest pool, Ant Pool, the largest mining pool. So when you're a miner, if you mine by yourself, there's a lot of variance. You might not get paid for months, days, years, a long period of time. So people pool their mining resources together, and they get paid way more frequently. So a lot of people use mining pools. But the mining pool operator has a lot of control. They can choose which transactions get mined, and in the case of a fork, they can choose which fork they want to mine. So Antpool had a lot of power, and Jihan Wu, the founder of Bitmain, co-founder of Bitmain, had a lot of indirect power. It was like hard to measure, but like his buddies in a room who were all buying ASICs from him probably accounted for 75% of the global hash rate or something crazy like that, right? 75% of miners were like on a first name basis with Jihan, and if he wanted something done, he could be like, if you don't do it, I'm not going to give you any more miners, right? He was their sugar daddy. He was the godfather. And he was pro this change called SegWit 2x, which was this idea of we package a soft fork consensus change, a SegWit, and we package it with a hard fork increase of the amount of block space that you could have in Bitcoin. So 2x, you have the SegWit part, and the 2x part was like, let's double the size of a Bitcoin block. And a whole consortium of suits in Bitcoin at the time, and they were immature suits, right? Like they were mostly led by Barry Silbert, who owes billions of dollars to people right now. These aren't like your classic Wall Street suits. They were like orange suits. They were like Bitcoin suits. They were like, we own all the companies in Bitcoin. We also want SegWit 2x. So there was like some kind of like loose agreement that happened. Most of the independent community did not want to increase the block size. And there was like kind of like this handshake agreement that SegWit 2x will implement in the fall, but in the meantime, we'll add SegWit now. This is the grand compromise. We'll add SegWit now. That's a soft fork. It's not going to break the consensus rules of the chain. If you're running an older client, you're still fine. It adds like a de facto block size increase because it discounts the witness, so you can have blocks up to 4 megabytes instead of the 1 megabyte. But it's a soft fork. And then in the fall, we'll do the 2x part. Jihan was like, these guys are just fucking with the suits. There's no shot in hell they're going to do this. So at the same time that SegWit got implemented, he did a hard fork for Bcash, and I think it was like 8x the block size or something. It was like his hedge, and he just really never had the balls to put the majority of hash onto Bcash. Like I think he could have made a couple calls and done it, but the actual game theory incentives of Bitcoin worked. Like his whole livelihood was based on Bitcoin. Like if he killed the golden goose, he would have been absolutely fucked. So he never did it. Like if you go back and you look at the hash rate differences, and there's a big issue. Like if you have for a long extended period of time 2 chains using the same hashing algorithm, SHA-256, the miners on the majority side can go and attack the other side and just do utter mayhem, right? Like if you have like 10% of the mining hash. So really you don't want to be in a situation where you have a chain that is secured by the same hashing algorithm as another chain that has significantly more hash than you. So yeah, I'm getting a little bit lost in the weeds, but Bcash never really had any kind of critical support. Now, I know of a lot of Bitcoiners that sold their Bitcoin Cash early on and throughout the whole process for more Bitcoin and had conviction in it. I assume a lot of the Bcashers did the same thing in the opposite way. Some of the more notable ones clearly didn't because they're still financially solvent now because Bcash is worth fucking nothing. And a lot of participants just completely sat it out. Like if you were an uneducated participant, that was probably the safest decision for you to make, is just completely sit it out. Now, the interesting thing on the ETF side is in the beginning, Coinbase, who was pro Bitcoin 2x, refused to give people their Bcash. They hesitated for a while. And there was a bunch of other custodians that did similar. And I think it was a learning experience for a lot of people on not your keys, not your coins. And I could 100% see similarities happen in ETF world where a BlackRock is like, we're not going to honor this fork and we're not going to give you the equivalent amount of coin for like on this fork. And there is an argument on the custodian side that it can be a little bit ridiculous. Like me, you, and Brian can go fork Bitcoin and call it, Bitcoin Onramp or Bitcoin Brian, right? We can create a chain called Bitcoin Brian. Like it's ridiculous for BlackRock to redeem to 10 million people Bitcoin Brian just because the 3 of us decided to fork. Like there should be like from a custodian side, right? There should be some kind of like critical mass where like then they'd decide like, okay, like this thing actually has market value. Like I should give you, your equivalent amount of money that you're due. But the way all these ETFs are written, it's just like completely up to their discretion, which makes sense. Like if they had lawyers write it, like it doesn't make sense. Like there's no objective measurement where a fork has merit and a fork doesn't, because we can make Bitcoin Brian and then Michael can buy like 1 sat from me for $1 billion. And then the thing's got like a ridiculous market cap. So like you can't use that market cap as the, obviously I'm being extreme there, right? But you can't use market cap as the rule there. So all these ETFs have it written that they can just decide which is real Bitcoin and which is not. And I think that will just be part of the learning experience. Like people will get rugged. People like the history of Bitcoin custodians is them either getting pressured by governments and rugging people, fucking something up, and people getting rugged unintentionally, or a government pointing a gun to their head and people getting rugged. And in every situation, there are thousands, hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands, I don't know how many people that learn their lesson and they're like, okay, I need to learn how to hold this thing securely myself because I trust that third parties are security holes. And if I have to trust someone else to hold my Bitcoin, they will probably fuck me over eventually.
Yep. There will be many more learnings going forward as a takeaway, most likely. One thing I wonder how many. Go ahead.
Brian, like I wonder how many participants like are in Bitcoin. How many people hold Bitcoin right now that just didn't exist during the 2017 fork? It's a lot of people. It's a lot of people,
Yeah.
and I think these, in a lot of ways, like Bitcoin is just going to be. I've been active in this space for over a decade now. It's just eternal September. Like it's just going to be over and over again. We're just going to learn the same lessons, but it's going to be new people learning the lessons, and it's going to be a slight twist, right? Like the difference between FTX and GOX isn't really that much. It's like different aspects of a Ponzi scheme.
It's funny.
And people learn it in their own way at their own time.
It's funny you bring up that question about how many people are in that weren't around in 17, because I think the other side of that is how many people were around in 17 that aren't around now. And this idea behind a lot of the stuff we work on, I think cumulatively as a group in own respects of like, there's this idea, and I don't obviously have hard numbers, but I feel like over 50% of people that have come into Bitcoin since its inception do not hold any Bitcoin anymore. And whether it's because they got shaken out, they sold too early, they were hacked, they left it on FTX or BlockFi or Genesis. It's like this idea that this thing is so foreign to everyone that they can't, unless they go down and really understand what they're doing and how they think about it. They just ultimately, and to your point, like last year, it seems already, FTX was only 12 months ago and people don't even talk about it. It seems like it's good. And like, that was the scary part. A lot of what we're doing here is my concern. I don't know if I share this with you, Matt, was behind a lot of this stuff was seeing Wall Street come in and realizing that they were using the same stuff that existed in 2022 when everything blew up. And then we were going to get orders of magnitude more carnage in like 2028. In my mind, it was 2026 or 2028. They were just going to blow it all up again. And it was like, shit, well, these guys weren't the smartest guys in the room when we think about, silver. I was like, why couldn't we have a lot of learning based on all the things we've done? And I know it's not full, obviously the self-custody, but there's this idea of like, you mentioned it earlier, and I think it's key, is distributed. Like there is no pure or perfect, decentralization, but there's enough where, and we don't know what it is yet, but of distribution where the game theory starts to shift on like, does it make sense? Where if you don't have to trust a single entity, how many can you trust? Where it kind of starts to look more like a traditional firm that you're used to, that we've historically used for thousands of years, while you can also still bet. And then it comes more to like trust in people get rugged and then you don't trust them to sign or trust them to be your partner. Because I think that's more of like what we've seen over time, so yeah, the distribution I think is key because, and that's another part of kind of joke around with like the difference between Bitcoin and gold is not the like digital nature of it. It's multi-sig. It's the fact that like you can actually put it in multiple locations, or you can have multiple entities participate, and it's transparent, because that's ultimately where gold really failed, was the centralization of like entities and all the like, go ahead.
I mean, try and take custody of gold. Like what, you're going to just take 2 tons of gold custody? Like how the hell are you going to handle that? You're going to put it on a plane? Is there going to be like vans with guys with fucking guns like bringing it over to you? And then when you get it, where do you put it? With Bitcoin, you can just, it's so easy to take self custody, and that's what people don't realize. The games will still be played. We haven't solved that. Like there will be paper Bitcoin games, there'll be Ponzi schemes, there'll be blow ups, there'll be leverage, there'll be degens. Everyone's humans are degens. They're inherently degens. It's the reality of the situation. There's a reason why the US government has maintained a legalized monopoly on lotteries. Is because they make a shit ton of fucking money, because people just want to scratch off a fucking card for $5 and potentially win 10,000 a week for life. People are degens. And as a result, free markets are naturally volatile short term. And for people that can scare the shit out of them with Bitcoin, because if you've been coddled in your pretend free markets that are the US financial system, that aren't actually free, that have circuit breakers, that have all these different centralized manipulations that are designed to try and stop downward volatility, specifically people quote unquote losing money, it is hard for people to fathom. But in a proper free market, what happens is degens will get wiped out, they will get wrecked. There'll be some short-term pain for people that rely on Bitcoin as as their main asset, that that their main savings that they're spending from when necessary. But ultimately, the market demand will bring it back to its fair purchasing power, right? Like the fair purchasing power price. And the way I look at Bitcoin is it's the most scarce asset we've ever seen. And so with adoption, purchasing power should naturally increase, and you can measure that purchasing power in dollars, right? Like I'm a weird person, right? Because there's like a whole subset of Bitcoiners that are like, I'm in it for the tech, and there's a whole subset of Bitcoiners that I'm in it for the riches. I'm in it for both. Like I'm in it for the freedom, but I like to get wealthy along the way. Like I'm not going to keep my savings in something I think is going to erode value over time. And Bitcoin is this beautiful free market where it just because it doesn't require permission, because it doesn't have centralized entities in control, that works itself out. But humans are the market participants, so it will be volatile. It will take those tendencies from its participants and reflect them in the market.
Yeah, I think that's a key part of this pod, and specifically around why like the volatility scares so many people. It's like, well, they start looking at the technology. It's like, well, what can the technology do? Because I don't want nothing to do with the volatility. You mentioned final settlement. It made me think of try to final settle $1 billion worth of gold across the Red Sea right now. You're just like, it does not work.
I mean, Russia, I forget when it happened. It was like within the last 2 years or whatever. It was like super memeable. But like Russia had like a plane full of gold that like the gold fell out of the plane midway, and like people just had like gold bars like falling on their heads. Like it's a real problem. It's a real fucking thing. And that's why we have so much paper gold, because it's way easier to buy GLD on TD Ameritrade or Charles Schwab than it is to take substantial custody of gold. And it doesn't count if your uncle has, 5 Krugerrands. Like it just doesn't move the market in the way that someone can take easy self-custody of $1 billion worth of Bitcoin. It's just a whole different ballgame.
Thanks for tuning in. If you're interested in exploring any of these topics further, or want to learn more about how we can help you secure a new or existing Bitcoin allocation, get in touch with our team at onrampbitcoin.com. We look forward to supporting you on your Bitcoin journey.
Yep. You mentioned degens, and that reminded me of what I wanted to go back to. Was when you were talking earlier, you mentioned one of the more recent meaningful upgrades to Bitcoin was Taproot a few years back. And years later, there are some basically externalities, positive, negative, of that upgrade that are now being leveraged for people to basically, at a very high level, somewhat bring NFTs. So, something that was originated on Bitcoin back in the day, but then really gained a lot of hype on all these other crypto networks, but bring NFTs to Bitcoin again in a way that basically, there's different cohorts of Bitcoiners that view this topic from different perspectives. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on it. Generally speaking, are Ordinals and Inscriptions an attack on Bitcoin? I don't see it that way. I think generally these represent valid transactions that will ultimately be priced out in the future. But there's past 12 months have been this has been the topic du jour of sort of Bitcoin development, Bitcoin community, in terms of, in some ways it's the argument is really, it's related to sort of like the ossification versus innovation camps, generally speaking, right? Like, do we want to try to bring all these other things and forms of functionality to the base layer in a way that could, basically clog the chain or compromise it in other ways? And it also comes back to like assessing trade-offs, right? Generally speaking, which is something you talk a lot about, Matt, and trying to think about, from a very adversarial perspective, like what are the possible externalities of any change that you make to Bitcoin? So what are your thoughts generally on all of that? This change that occurred years ago, but is now sort of come back up as a topic of discussion because of how people are leveraging it.
So, first of all, it's a misconception that Taproot enables all this stuff. You can do different, a little bit more efficient from a cost perspective things with Taproot, but you can do these things regardless. There's also a misconception that NFTs are the main driver of these things. It's mostly been these like scam tokens, like these meme tokens. I think the biggest one is called Ordi,
which
and
are
like they have
are functionless tokens.
they
right?
have
So
zero
they're
utility.
basically NFTs without art. Like that's
they're
kind of how I
collectibles.
view it, right? Like yeah, exactly.
They're text NFTs.
Yeah.
Look, if you have a Bitcoin transaction and it's valid by the rules of the network, of the nodes that are running, and you pay a market rate transaction fee, it will get confirmed by the network. It is a valid transaction as far as the network is concerned. Now, people that are smarter than me, specifically Andrew Polstra, who's a fucking legend. He was my guest for the single best interview I ever did in Austin at Bitcoin Commons, where we had a half an hour on his history in open source. And I asked him, what is your history in open source? And then he talked for a half an hour and gave us a perfect like rundown of everything, then turned back to me. And I was like, we're done. And it's like, it's over. Like, that's the interview. I literally just asked one question, but the guy's a fucking legend. He does not think there's a way to stop people on a technical level for making these transactions. So I think that whole argument, this whole idea that like we should even be wasting time thinking about it is from the incorrect premise. Because if Polster doesn't think it's possible to do it, then I'm going to defer to him on that. But regardless, we have Mononaut from Mempool Space. He's one of the main guys on the team over there. And he did an analysis of this year. This year, there was so Bitcoin miners get paid a subsidy, and that subsidy has halvings every 4 years. It splits in half, right? Right now they get paid 6.25 Bitcoin per block, and then somewhere in the spring, it's based on blocks, not on actual like Gregorian calendar or whatever. Just made up bullshit. It's based on blocks. It's somewhere in the spring, right? And then it's going to drop to 3.125 subsidy. So this is Bitcoin's built-in system to regulate monetary supply, right? So new Bitcoin that get issued get halved. But Bitcoin miners also receive fees, and the fees are a pure free market without permission. And they are simply handled on a supply-demand basis. You have a fixed supply of block space available, and as more Bitcoin transactions are being sent, you have to pay a higher fee. Otherwise, miners will be unlikely to confirm them. Miners can confirm whatever transactions they want to confirm, but usually they confirm the highest fee transactions first because they make more money. So we had 23,431 Bitcoin were paid in miner fees this year. Fucking massive number. And according to his analysis, 63.8% were quote unquote normal Bitcoin transactions, just regular Bitcoin transactions. The NFTs were 2.4%, and these scam tokens were 27.9%. So the majority is these scam tokens. Now, when you're thinking about inscriptions are real. They're real. Like, you can do a valid Bitcoin transaction and you can inscribe data along with it in the blockchain. That is there for everyone who's running Bitcoin software. It's in their ledger. Those could be JPEGs, those could be text, whatever. Now, they've married them with something called Ordinals, which is a separate from the chain theory. And that's how they say you can transfer the inscriptions. But inscriptions are real. You can't transfer the inscriptions. Like the Bitcoin protocol doesn't let you transfer the JPEG from one address to another address. It's just in the fucking ledger, right? Or the text of the token, right? It says Ordi token, you own number 2 of 1,000 or whatever. It's just like a little simple JSON text. There's no way to actually transfer them in the mechanism. So I think this will become, I mean, first of all, besides the fact that I don't think these things really have collectible value, I think the fact that you can't transfer them will become apparent to people because, look, at the end of the day, humans like collectibles, especially Bitcoiners. Most Bitcoiners, like if you go back, we had some like ridiculous collectibles that we were like obsessed with before Bitcoin existed. I know my family got wrecked on Beanie Babies. I was like a big baseball cards guy. All centralized bullshit collectibles. I have like a signed Shaq, basketball. I got Pete Rose. I got David Cohn. Like I got all my like baseball collectibles, basketball collectibles. It's all bullshit compared to Bitcoin. Like Bitcoin is is of just what I should have my entire net worth in, and I have the majority of my net worth in. But anyway, my point is, I'm going past the point. People like collectibles. I'm not saying you could do whatever collectibles you want. I don't think they compete with Bitcoin. But I think the market will start to realize eventually that you can't transfer these things between each other, and that it's all bullshit. It's just a centralized system that's bolted on top, that they're just assuming like, oh, I transfer this, I transfer that. But the actual inscription part is kind of interesting, because you can do things like inscribe banned books, right? You can inscribe, and that might actually have like a significant financial worth in the future. Like someone just to get the information out there might be willing to pay for it, even though they don't think it has any kind of collectible value or something like that. But regardless, we can't stop it. You can't transfer them. And as a result, the Bitcoin fee market is working as designed. So like when you do email, right? The big issue with all these things, all kind of communication networks, is spam, right? So what is spam? Spam is something you don't want, right? There's no objective definition of spam, but spam is something that you as an individual subjectively do not appreciate getting, right? And with email, the way we handle spam is we have centralized services like Google and their cohort decide what they're blacklisting and what they're not, and they're making decisions based on it. And obviously that's inherently able to corrupt, right? We can inherently corrupt that. Someone can get a gun to their head and say, this mail registrar should always be declared as spam. And then it doesn't matter how much you care about freedom. If you're trying to email someone on Gmail, it's going to go straight to the spam folder. On websites, we have something called distributed denial of service attacks, DDoSs. And that's like you just hit a website from a bunch of different computers, oftentimes botnets, and you bring it to its knees. And how do they handle that? A lot of times through centralized services like Cloudflare that are sitting in the middle, and they're saying that IP address is a bad IP address, that IP address is a bad address. We're not going to give them the website, but we'll give this other guy the website because he's KYC'd on Comcast and we know he's a good dude. Can't have that in Bitcoin either. So what does Bitcoin do? We have this scarce block space. And why is the block space scarce? Because every node needs to store and validate that information. And so it adds real cost to running a node, and it's important that everyone can run their own node. So what do? We have a dynamic free market where if you send a Bitcoin transaction, it has to be valid by the consensus rules, number one. That's what inscriptions are. It's a fact, regardless of how you feel about them. Valid by Bitcoin consensus rules, and a fee that is acceptable to a miner to mine that transaction. So you end up in a situation where the real argument is, if someone I don't like is flooding the Bitcoin network with transactions and it's crowding out people I like from sending Bitcoin transactions, is that a problem? Yeah, it is a problem. And Bitcoin transaction fees are designed to mitigate that problem, because if we forget about inscriptions altogether, let's pretend the US government decides they don't want us to use Bitcoin. They're not using inscriptions. They're just sending Bitcoin transactions back and forth between each other at a high fee to try and stop Bitcoiners from transacting. That's a real attack method, right? That's a potential attack vector that Bitcoiners have talked about in the past. They would have to spend billions of dollars in Bitcoin mining fees to miners. They would have to buy the Bitcoin. They would have to spend it to miners. They would have to essentially take existing supply off the market when they bought it, increasing the purchasing power of Bitcoin. And then they'd have to repeat that year after year after year for increasingly larger amounts of fiat, because it's all denominated in Bitcoin. It is the best incentive mechanism ever. It's like literally, to attack it, they have to feed the Ponzi. It is the most insane fucking system, and it works. So the result is, at the end of the day, right now, maybe you're crowded out, maybe fees are too high for you, and you're an African, and you're making $5 a day, and it's just too expensive for you. But ultimately, and that sucks. And hopefully we'll have tools available to people that they'll be able to efficiently use Bitcoin at smaller amounts and different trade-off balances, like all this different stuff, collaborative multi-sig, Fedimint, stuff like that. Maybe responsible custodial solutions. Like these tools don't get built out unless there's fee pressure. But ultimately, the malicious entity will run out of money eventually, And in the meantime, they increase the purchasing power of Bitcoin, and they provide direct funding to mining infrastructure. And that's how the whole system is designed and how it works. And it's working fucking beautifully right now.
It's funny you tied it back all the way to the game theory and the incentive working how it's supposed to, because it was something I was going to reference. You like tied it exactly. It's different camps, but same argument around ETF and is it good or bad for Bitcoin, or Inscription, is it good or bad? It's literally the same thing. It's like they're valid transactions and you have to participate in the network. And then on the other side of that, everybody benefits. Even though at short term, certain people think, may get rugged and all the things associated, they need to buy the Bitcoin. They have to take it off the market. It's the exact same conversation.
It's fucking beautiful.
Beautiful incentives.
And it's just like, yeah, there's just like this like non-practical sense of an individual that is like, it's like the same thought of like coming in, I'm here to fix Bitcoin. It's like, this isn't a fair transaction, or this isn't a fair way to custody the Bitcoin. It's like, there's like your version of spam being subjective, like it is subjective. It's like, what is the objective way to use Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, like if you look at the math right now today, the math is if the US government or anyone else wanted to like peg fee rates at 200 sats per byte, right? Like if you go to mempool.space right now, the next block fee is like probably like 70, 80 sats per byte, maybe 90 sats per byte. If the US government wanted to peg it at 200 sats per byte, it's like $8 to $12 billion because it's in Bitcoin terms. So it depends where Bitcoin's moving and whatnot. And they have to actually buy the Bitcoin. And that's just 1 year. And by buying the Bitcoin, it's increasing the purchasing power of Bitcoin. So my answer to them is attack us. That would be wonderful. I can, I'll stop making the Bitcoin transactions that I don't absolutely need to make. I'll continue to make the ones that I absolutely need to make, and I'll wait you out.
Beautiful incentives. We've talked a lot about development, how it works, consensus. I think what I'd be curious to hear from you, Matt, is what excites you going forward in the development space, certain projects, whether it be related to the build out of the Lightning Network, things like NOSTR, different initiatives like Fediments. What are you most excited about sort of heading into the new year from a development perspective, and why?
Well, I mean, I'm really incredible. I'm really excited about NOSTR. It's not Bitcoin specific.
Yeah.
The idea of NOSTR is a censorship-resistant, permissionless, interoperable communication protocol. And it's just really complementary to Bitcoin because you have a censorship-resistant, permissionless, interoperable money, and then you have the equivalent on communications, and then all of a sudden wallets can communicate with each other. You can have freedom aspects like a freedom Venmo. You can have a freedom Twitter that has Bitcoin integrated. Like there's all these different cool complementary aspects of it. And it's also based in this idea of freedom tech, and it's completely open source.
Yep. Harkens back to what we started the conversation
really
with
cool.
In terms of like the actual advantages of building things that are open source and interoperable. NOSTR is a perfect example of that. Maybe you could go into a bit more detail in terms of like how it actually works, how some of this sort of fundamental architecture is similar to Bitcoin with public and private keys, and maybe some applications that you think have gotten some decent traction thus far, and where you think things are headed.
Well, the thing is, NOSTR is incredibly early, and like I said, it's not necessarily Bitcoin specific. I think it's just it's to me it's this compelling freedom tech stack that I haven't been this excited about since I discovered Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. And so it has all these similarities to Bitcoin. It is also very different from Bitcoin. The whole idea of the consensus rules and stuff that we're talking about with Bitcoin doesn't exist with NOSTR because you don't have this, omnibus financial ledger like a blockchain.
Right.
It's like different clients can implement what they want to implement, and like worst comes to worst, they can't communicate with each other, and like the world doesn't end. You don't like lose your life savings. Like a government doesn't lose their entire central bank treasury because you like did a consensus change. So you're able to, iterate and innovate quicker. But at the same time, to me, it feels like maybe what Bitcoin probably felt like in the early days of Bitcoin, but I didn't get to be there for that. And I get to be there for NOSTR, and it's super fucking cool, and the potential is really huge. And I think basically every Bitcoin company becomes a NOSTR company. Every NOSTR company has a Bitcoin. I think every company becomes a Bitcoin company, period. And I think they also probably become NOSTR companies. Just like every company has an email strategy, because you just can't run a business without an email strategy. It's like it's not like, oh, this is a credit card business. And it's like, they accept credit cards. They have to accept credit cards. They have to accept Bitcoin. They have to communicate via NOSTR. Like, it'll just be the standard protocols. On the Bitcoin side, I don't want to get too far into NOSTR because it's a little bit of a rabbit hole. But on the Bitcoin, yeah, go on, Tanguma.
I think an important part about NOSTR, independent of NOSTR, what Matt's alluding to is, I think, and this is a different conversation, but like NOSTR really can't exist from a long-term perspective without Bitcoin. From like a censorship, from like running relays and the ability like to run certain servers that potentially could, because at the end of the day, like, there's economics tied to it, and to be able to pay somebody for it if you get shut off via like your credit card, how do you? The only thing
is, yes, I on a technical basis, yes, NOSTR could exist without Bitcoin, but we are living in a new paradigm now, where open source software is much easier to monetize if you have a programmable money that has final settlement without a trusted third party. Like, Bitcoin changes the whole dynamic, not just for NOSTR, but any freedom software. Because historically, if you were running an open source project and you wanted to try and ethically monetize it, you had to get a credit card processor. You had to bring trusted third parties into it. Maybe you're doing some KYC elements. You have to collect billing addresses. You have this whole fucking burden. Maybe you have to start a company, do all this other stuff. The perfect example is something like Sparrow Wallet. Right? Doesn't have any NOSTR integration, completely separate to NOSTR. It's a Bitcoin wallet, best Bitcoin wallet available. And the lead developer is this guy called Craig Raw. He's from South Africa. Doesn't have a company. Did not create a corporate entity. Does not integrate with Square or any kind of payment processors. And he has reoccurring Bitcoin revenue that supports the project. Right. And people are able to just pay him Bitcoin as for CoinJoin fees in his particular situation, but they're able to pay him Bitcoin for a service they want. And he's able to monetize that across the entire globe for his open source software. And if you want to fork his software and do whatever you want because it's open source, you can do that. But you won't be able to collect the fees that he collects, right? Because the fees are attached to a network effect in terms of liquidity of users. So this is something specifically that we've been watching very closely at 1031 and OpenSats, is this idea of monetizable open source projects, and they're monetized with Bitcoin. And I think NOSTR greatly benefits from that aspect. Things like relays, things like clients, they can monetize using Bitcoin. And they don't have to integrate with the traditional financial system and all the trusted third parties that come with it, if that makes sense.
No, it makes complete sense. And that's kind of where I wanted just at least to tie back. Well, before we go directly to Bitcoin and Matt's thoughts there, you alluded to very beginning, like your journey and the loss of trust in financial institutions and intermediaries, which I think most that have like looked at Bitcoin can understand why there's value. But then you referenced post that, looking at like the conglomerates that require trust and centralization. And there's this realization that exists for a reason, and we all know of like or we may have known like Operation Choke Point and these like aspects of like these central points, whether it's a tech stack or financial service stack, where the money starts to like, well, you can't stop certain aspects. You can stop the money flows, which effectively second, third order effects stop the actual actions. And it kind of dawned on me, and this is part of like what we want to do here in the pod, and like hopefully we get you back on and other individuals, where it's like, when you start to squint and you look at the disruptive technologies, you can start to realize that it's not the incumbents. Like, they will be left completely behind because these are meant to like fundamentally disrupt their models. And so Bitcoin's an easy example of that. But then Bitcoin actually pins everything else that disrupts everything past that, because you can't stop it. And so like NOSTR is just this first example, and you need like speech to be able to like actually do these things. And that's why I fall in this like middle camp versus some of our other friends that may not find it valuable. It's like, you actually have to be able to coordinate and like discuss. But this is like where the AI thing comes into play too, because these things are so disruptive that you'll ultimately try to stop them, but then you need the money to keep the juice running, whether it's the power or the servers or all the other things associated. And that's how this whole thing when we come down to
Yep.
final settlements, like how do we actually ideate and see the reality of how this thing changes almost everything, and then what are the practical use cases? Because we're not even at the ball game yet. We're like showing up.
Right.
We're still like, if you're in Texas, you have your roadie and you're driving to the Cowboy Stadium just to start. Like the national anthem hasn't even begun. Matt Odell still singing in the back of the truck with his shirt off, and it's
Yeah,
just
we're still tailgating.
we're still tailgating. We haven't even gotten to
No, I mean, you're absolutely correct. I mean, NOSTR is particularly a special beast because, it's the brainchild of Bitcoin developers. Like Bitcoin developers, like Fiat Jaff, Will Cicerin, like Kooks, like they like set up the basis of like Fiat Jaff published the original spec. Like it was Bitcoiners that created it. But yeah, I mean, I 100% agree. And I would just say to people like, look, NOSTR's really early. I think it's something you should pay attention to. The main product that exists right now that uses NOSTR is basically a censorship resistant alternative to Twitter, or Facebook, where like Elon can't stop you, Zuck can't stop you, anyone holding a gun to either of their heads can't stop you. The easiest way to interact with that is an app called Primal. You can search it on your app store, Primal, Primal. And yeah, it looks like Twitter. It's just hard to censor, and you can just post whatever the fuck you want, and no one can stop you. And I think people will start to realize the implications there. I mean, I'm also I think Mutiny Wallet is like way on the forefront of it. Mutiny Wallet right now, you can run you essentially have a full Lightning node in your browser of any phone. You just type in mutinywallet.com. They didn't have to integrate with a traditional financial system because it's a Bitcoin wallet. And they didn't have to integrate with a social network graph like the Venmo API or the Twitter API or the Facebook API because they just integrated with NOSTR. So they're essentially building Freedom Venmo, and they're building it on two open source stacks, Bitcoin and NOSTR. And so for the average person, like it won't hit them until like V5, right? Where it's like super polished. Everything seems exactly the same as their surveilled and controlled alternatives. But it's actually based on freedom technology, and they get all the benefits of that. And they don't even necessarily, for a lot of people in the beginning, won't realize the freedom benefits. They just realize the lack of friction where they don't have to do the KYC process. They don't have to confirm 2 deposits in their bank account. They don't have to, like, oh, you deposited 23 cents in my bank account on whatever, like all that friction that comes with the traditional financial system. They just won't have to deal with in the traditional communication networks. And that's where it all starts to come together. And like you said, we're tailgating. Like it is so fucking early. It's a meme because it's based in reality. Like good memes are based in reality. And like, I cannot overstate how early we are in both Bitcoin, NOSTR, like all this shit. Like people are sleeping on it, and we can just scream it from the rooftops. All this alpha, I can just scream it from the rooftops. No one executes, no one pays attention. I'm going to be screaming it for like next 4 years, 5 years, 10 years.
I have this joke I've been saying, and it's just been like, I'm sure you know this, you've just been living it. You yourself know this, and anybody that's following the space, if you generally have a good idea in the real world, it's probably a bad idea. Like it's already been thought of and it just wasn't good. Like it just actually wasn't a good idea. Couldn't make money, couldn't do it. But in Bitcoin, like if you look at something, you're like, it should exist, or why isn't this exist? It's probably, or most likely is a good idea, and just somebody hasn't done it yet because
they just haven't executed.
We're still so early. Yeah. And this idea of like
true.
The guys that know Bitcoin developing NOSTR, you can actually start to see like there's a certain lens, and it has nothing to do with ideology. It has to do with like understanding in practice how systems need to be built from a resiliency standpoint, where then you start in like redundancy standpoint, where you start to think about like, you reference NOSTR, and is it just, distributed enough? It's like, no, it's just distributed enough to do what it needs to do. And then the game theory around, if you take something around, it doesn't kill it. It's just the next thing that can exist. And that's the whole idea. It doesn't like everybody's mental model starts to map to like Bitcoin or other things. It's just mapped to the use case that's needed.
You also mentioned AI. And so I don't want to miss the opportunity to say 3 buzzwords together. I believe the future is NOSTR, AI, and Bitcoin combined, where the AI communicates with people and other AI bots using Nostr, and all the payments are handled with Bitcoin. And I think people will start to realize the issues. It'll become overly apparent, the issues with centralized entities running these AI models, because of how crippled they will become due to regulations. And if you use a freedom-focused one, you're not necessarily doing it for the freedom. You're just doing it because you get better results that are not biased, because they don't have a bunch of woke regulators that are deciding what your results are on your AI search.
Can you actually plug MVK's deal just because that just launched, and just to break down like what that's, because I feel like that's partially an example of it.
Yeah, so MVK has a service called unleashed.chat, which runs open source AI models in your browser locally. Well, the models are run on a, like a cloud server, but all your history is held locally. So it's designed to be more private than like the chat GPTs and stuff like that. And you simply pay Bitcoin to use it. I would call that, MVP 1, minimum viable product 1, of what we could see here. At the basis, like, it's centralized, obviously. It's just completely centralized. But centralized things are easier to use. So if regulators don't come in and say, like, you can't do this, like, it makes sense, and it fills a very easy niche. And it's a perfect example of Bitcoin allowing people to monetize ethically because they don't have to take private information, right? Like, if you use something like ChatGPT, even if they're not surveilling all of your searches and everything, which they are, and like building their models against it, at the very least, they have your credit card and billing information attached to you, right? Because you can't just pay in Bitcoin. Now, on the Nostr side, and so he does have some Nostr integration where he takes every single Nostr post that has ever existed, and he put it into his AI model. So you can search through the history of Nostr, right? And this is another situation where like open systems win, right? Because all these big tech companies are doing the opposite. They're closing the silos. I don't know if you've realized, like, if you try and click a Reddit link, it like almost always asks you to sign in. If it's anything good, if they rate it like over 18 plus, you have to sign in. If you click a Twitter link, you can't see any of the replies or anything unless you sign in, right? LinkedIn has been doing it for ages. Instagram has been doing it for a long time. They're all closing up their shit because they know that the users are their product, even though the users think they're their customer, and they want to protect the product at all costs, and they want to charge you for API access if you want to use it. Nostr's not that case. You don't have to pay for an API. So everyone who's using Nostr is contributing to this global open database of signed cryptographic posts. And he just uploaded it all without permission to his open source large language model, LLM. And as a result, you can search through all the Nostr posts. But when I say Nostr AI and Bitcoin, what I imagine, and this is what Pablo's been working on. Pablo 7Z is like this ridiculous, prolific Bitcoin and Nostr developer. Is this idea, he calls it DVMs, data vending machines. And it's like this idea of a marketplace of AI bots, right? That are competing on a free market in terms of price, reliability, output, like how good their results are. And they can work together communicating via Nostr, and they can bid against each other via Nostr, and you pay them with Bitcoin. So like, there's a situation where instead of paying one large model to do the whole thing you need to do, let's say you need to look at a picture, you need to figure out who the people are in the picture, then you need to write a bio about them, and then you need to submit the bio as a Nostr post. You could have 3 different AIs do that, and they can all pay each other in between with Bitcoin, all communicate with Nostr, and you can get the best price and the best output. And for the user, we're still a ways off from this, but from the user, it should be a nice, clean flow, right? Where they don't realize, they're like, I just need this thing, and I need it to be the best it can possibly be, and I'm willing to pay market rate, and the whole thing just happens. And that's fucking crazy, right? Then we're in a whole new ball game, and it's reliant on these open systems all being able to interact with each other, if that makes any sense.
Yeah,
it makes sense. One thing, just Brian, I know you want to transition, is what's exciting about this, and it just dawned on me, Matt, like, this is really inevitable. And while it sounds crazy, it's like, it's just as inevitable as we feel about Bitcoin. And like, it's essentially because of the alternative it has to be inevitable, basically, because the alternative is like the systems you reference closing. Like that's the nice version of like systems starting to close, and it really hit me.
Digital
with
slavery is the alternative.
Yeah. I mean, it's exactly right. And like this AI, like the LLMs, along with the neural nets, when they get like good enough, people and like nation states are going to freak out, just like they're going to freak out about like censorship resistant money. It's a very similar concept. And then they have to, and so then you need something they have to like coincide together and start to move together in the same way. Like to be able to speak freely, you're going to need a version of that. And so it's just a natural order of how like we move into a transition to a new age. And it's just a weird thing because I hadn't thought about it in that same way of like Bitcoin the past 6 years has felt inevitable, but this all feels inevitable as like this starts to interweave with each other. There's no alternative because there just can't be another alternative.
Yeah, no, it's super fascinating, and open systems win. I totally agree with that. But Matt, can you elaborate on, because I think we need to be wary of, basically there's going to be other attempts at doing these types of things with the broader crypto space, right? And we've already seen some of this to some extent. But why elaborate for the listeners on why, again, building on open interoperable systems that are based on a solid foundation of a monetary unit that can be ubiquitous within these connected protocols, why is that the better route than having these disparate systems of crypto tokens, which may garner more attention early because it's like just greed and grift of people thinking that they can be early to these things and be profitable by participating in these quote unquote open systems that are enabling different things with AI or decentralized communications, whatever it may be. Elaborate on why it has to be built on something like Bitcoin.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, if the open systems that will win, they win because they win because humans can't help themselves, and they destroy the systems that require trust. Like if you can make a payment on PayPal around the world, let's forget the debasement aspect of the dollar, and that like you can't really self-custody a dollar because they can just debase you at will. We'll just forget about that for a second. But let's say you can just send money around the world with PayPal without KYC. They can't block you. They don't seize your money. You never get rugged. The value prop of Bitcoin goes down because a centralized alternative that is cheaper and faster works and gets the job done well enough that you don't need something like that. If Elon, for some reason, is like a god among men and doesn't censor anybody and is able to stop regulators with guns telling him that he needs to ban Alex Jones, then NOSTR has less use cases, right? Because you can just use the centralized alternative that is cheaper and faster and prettier, and you don't have to use the freedom alternative. But the reality is humans can't help themselves. Like if you have a centralized third party, they will either get greedy or someone who has power over them will get greedy, and it destroys those systems. And I think they get outcompeted by the systems that don't require permission. And I see that with NOSTR and I see that with Bitcoin. And I would push back against the idea of inevitably. I would push back on that idea because it does create complacency to a degree. And at the end of the day, these things are easy to think of as tech projects, but they're movements of individuals. It's individuals deciding that they wanted to better their lives and push this thing forward, and we need people to stand up. Like people need to stand up and push it forward. Now, I think we have the momentum on the Bitcoin side. I'm pretty sure. Like I have incredible conviction on Bitcoin. On the NOSTR side, it's still very nascent and early, and I have less so conviction on that regard. But I think people shouldn't get complacent. And in both of these cases, when you have open systems, and I'll bring it back to the original question, which was like, what am I most excited about in Bitcoin? Is when you have these open permissionless systems, which, by the way, two of the things that make NOSTR and Bitcoin similar is they had a benevolent creator that didn't want fame and control. And I think that is underrated and is very uncommon. I don't think America would be in the place it was in today if George Washington decided that he wanted to do 3 terms or 4 terms or 5 terms and become king, right? Like it actually, like the history of America comes down to like one dude sitting in his parlor, like drinking tea and like talking to his boys, and was like, I probably shouldn't do that, right? Like I could do it. Like like if Dan Held was in charge at that point, like we might be in a completely different situation. So like I think people discount that, right? And Fiat Jeff deserves a lot of credit in that regard. Like he never wanted personal fame, he never wanted personal control. Same with Satoshi. And that's very hard to recreate. Like you need people that are willing to do that. The original creator needs to do that, and it goes against natural human desires and wills, like emotion to control things. But when you're talking about these open permissionless networks that are not controlled by people, the only way they improve and innovate is with pressure, with market pressure, with like iron sharpens iron. Like you need pain before there's actually market demand to improve things in these open systems. NOSTR is super nascent. There's going to be all these different pain points, and as we hit those pain points, the hope is that open source contributors around the world will build tools and improvements that will get us past those points. Now with Bitcoin, we've gotten through a lot of the pain points, but one of the big ones is block space is scarce. With adoption, transaction fees should increase, right? Humans increase. Humans have a tendency to increase exponentially. We grow very fast. We have lots of children. Our production increases, right? Our GDP increases. All these things increase. Block space does not increase. So, as people transact more in Bitcoin, regardless of their degens or not, transaction fees should increase because there's more people transacting and there's the same amount of block space. And we just have not been in this environment for very long. So we should see substantial improvements in terms of the tools and services that are built on top of Bitcoin in terms of handling high fee environments. And the big one that has been championed for years in Bitcoin circles has been Lightning, the Lightning Network. This idea of basically an interoperable protocol of batched Bitcoin payments. I can make a single on-chain transaction to open a Lightning channel, and then I can send 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 Bitcoin transactions through Lightning without trusting a third party. And then I can close that channel, and there's only 2 Bitcoin transactions on chain. I'm only paying my transaction fee twice, but I'm able to send 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 transactions through that channel before I close it. It has been heralded as a way to be more efficient with your transaction fee burden, and it is. But it has not been built to the point where it is very... It has issues in a high fee environment, which is insane, right? Because that is like almost exactly what it's trying to solve for. But it hasn't existed in a high fee environment. So it's kind of, it's to be expected.
That's the pressure
so with
that
this,
you talked about.
Yeah. So with this pressure, we're seeing this pressure, the tools should get better. The layer 2s should get better. All these different toolings on the sides, the businesses should interact with Bitcoin in a more efficient way. Because at the end of the day, they have the best incentive ever. It will cost them more not to. And they have to figure out how to do it in the most cost-effective way possible. Otherwise, they will lose money. So if you asked me 2 years ago, what was I most excited about with Bitcoin? I probably would have said the Fedimint project. And people thought I was fucking crazy. They're like, that's a custodian. Oh, but it's a multi-sig custodian. I don't care, Matt. Not your keys, not your coins. Oh, but the multi-sig custodian can't see your transactions. Yeah, I don't care, Matt. It's still a custodian. It's like, okay, but it's interoperable with the Lightning Network between other multi-sig custodians. And all of a sudden, 2 years later, you start to see why a project like Fedimint should exist. It should exist because people need to be able to use the chain more efficiently. And if you have a low-value transactions that you're trying to save in low-value amounts in terms of sats, in terms of Bitcoin, or transact in low-value amounts, you're going to have to figure out ways to share UTXOs with other people. You're going to have to figure out, clever, good trade-off mechanisms to do this on a higher layer above Bitcoin. And so I'm excited about Fedimint. I'm excited about Lightning innovation. I'm excited about things like state chains. I think there's going to be really compelling innovation in terms of efficiently using Bitcoin in a relatively secure and private way. in a sustained high fee environment, and it was never going to happen unless we had one.
Right. That's a great point. And nice transition to something else I wanted to talk about, which you mentioned earlier in the call, but your work with OpenSats, starting up that, maybe tell the listeners a little bit about what that is and why it's important. Generally speaking, related to what we just talked about in terms of tools being built when the pressure's there, and who's going to go build it? These open source contributors. So maybe shed a little light on what you've been doing there.
Yeah, so I mean, OpenSats is a 501c3 that I co-founded with this guy, Ben Price. He's the founder of the Bitcoin company. Great company. Does not run Bitcoin. I disagree with the name of his company, but he did name it the Bitcoin company. His lawyers also disagreed because he can't get it trademarked or anything. He has horrible SEO because if you search the Bitcoin company, there's like thousands of companies come up. But anyway, that was his prerogative. He came to me and he was like, let's start this 501c3 that supports open source contributors. I said, that sounds like a lot of paperwork. He's like, yeah, but it's needed. I was like, well, if you take care of the majority of the paperwork, like I'll help you build a board and do all the other good things, but like I just don't want to deal with paperwork. Fast forward to today, we have a great board. We have 9 people on our board, all great Bitcoiners that have strong reputations in the space. And what we do is we accept donations. You get a tax deduction if you're in America, if you want, or you can donate anonymously with Bitcoin. If you donate via credit card or wire, we automatically convert it into Bitcoin. All grants are paid out in Bitcoin. We take zero cut whatsoever. A lot of these charities will take 10, 20, 30, 40% for operations. We take zero cut. 100% gets passed through to open source contributors. We have a separate operations fund that pays for our few full-time employees that you can donate to separately if you want to support our operations. And that's how we're able to execute efficiently, but also in an ethical way. And it's relatively simple. You apply for a grant at opensats.org. Our 9-person board reviews it. We debate it. We argue about it. And then if you get 5 of 9 votes, you get approved. And the reason we have a 9-person board is to reduce corruption and bias. If you want to attempt to block someone, you need to get 4 other people to join you to block someone in a corrupt way. If you want to get something pushed through, you need to get 4 other people corrupted to push through something. So we naturally built it in a way that obviously it's still centralized, but trying to distribute those roles a little bit, right? Reduce the pressure on any individual. And I'll tell you, in the beginning, people thought we were fucking crazy because you have a 9-person board. There's a lot more friction to run that organization, right? You can't just like push changes through and change all this other stuff. But like Bitcoin, it was a feature, not a bug. And now that we have millions of dollars, we allocated over $7 million to open source contributors this year. That's a lot of money.
Incredible.
And there's a lot of great conspiracy theories where I'm like the head of the Illuminati or whatever. And we designed it so that I'm not. Like, that is the point. So if you have large tax gains, I know this is coming out like the first week of 2024, but this is going to be a baller year. You're going to have very large tax gains potentially. Consider donating to OpenSats and get your tax deduction. And if you're an open source contributor, consider applying. And why is this important? This is important because these open source contributors around the world are making this movement possible, and they're often not compensated whatsoever. It's usually a side hustle. It's something they're doing on the side. They work their 9 to 5 or their 7 to 10, like insane hours at their normal job, and then they come and they do their open source, almost charitable work. It's available to the public. It's free. Anyone can modify it. It's oftentimes hard to monetize, and we want to speed up this process. We want to speed up the process because we don't need freedom yesterday. We need freedom today, and the stakes are quite high. The stakes are quite high. At the end of the day, like if we fuck this up, like our children, they're digital slaves. They live in a complete dystopia. Like we need to make this shit happen. And if it's not us, then who's it going to fucking be? So it's important that there are these organizations, and there's other ones that are doing similar work. I like to think we're particularly unique in our scope and our scale. But giving these people the ability to say, no, I want to work full time on Bitcoin. I want to work full time on NOSTR. I want to work full time on Freedom Tech. and have a relatively, secure and sustainable salary, right? So like sometimes we'll do one-off grants, but also we have this idea, this long-term support program where like Bitcoin Core contributors, like people that are working on like the core foundational code that runs the Bitcoin network, we provide them 2-year grants where they know their monthly salary in dollar or euro terms, not in Bitcoin terms, dollar or euro terms, because that's what their rent is in. That's what they're paying for diapers in. That's what they're paying for food for their family in. And if they're going to leave Google, Amazon, Facebook, Twitter, and focus on Bitcoin, we need to provide them a competitive, safe compensation for that, right? And it speeds up the whole process. Like I don't think it's necessarily. I would hesitate to say it's required for this movement to happen, but we speed it up. And anyone who's building on top of these open source protocols, their company will benefit if they support these initiatives. Like if you are running an ETF, you should be donating a portion of your fees to open source contributors. They are a requirement for your business to function. And you will benefit significantly indirectly over the next 10 years if you do support this. If you are running Coinbase, you are building on top of these people. You should support them. It is in your best interest to support them. And we will make it as easy for you as possible. Whether you want to send us dollars, whether you want to send us Bitcoin, you don't have to do any of the hard work. We'll evaluate the projects. We'll stay on top of them. We'll decide if they get renewed or not. And to us, it's almost a full-time job for us. And in the classic state of open source, none of us get paid for it. So we're all doing this, pro bono or whatever. Not pro bono because we're not fucking lawyers, but we're doing it no salary to ourselves, because I think first of all because it's an important mission, but I think also like partially selfishly because I want there needs to be freedom in the world, and it's actually valuable if you think about it from a long-term horizon. If you think about it in a low time preference way, like it's valuable to all of us to support these open source ecosystems.
Yeah, and I think me and Matt have been friends for some time now, and I think partially we've really appreciated Matt's friendship and him just giving back to the space. It's very commendable to realize these things. They're very first principle. Like what you're describing reminds me of like who will build the roads, where people forgot about like the resilience of humans, or like if we look at it from an investment aspect of the network, it's like who will fix the code? It's like
who will ship the code?
Yeah, like we will fund it ourselves because that's what humans did and do when there's like meaning and things behind it. And this ties into like the aspect of Bitcoin and its resiliency to it. And then when you kind of tie in, and not to go down that rabbit hole, but it is relevant when you think about altcoins and pre-mines and all the things associated. It's like we need to figure out development. We got to figure it out. It's like this completely different. It's completely opposite.
Yeah, they're like dev funds and dev taxes,
right.
and shit.
And they'll say that's why we had to like pre-mine, and that's why we had to get the tokens, and why we had to put $10 million in this, and all the things associated. And so I just think it's very important to just realize and highlight, like, this is how society generally worked for hundreds and thousands of years. Is like you create capital, you benefit from the capital, you give back because it actually benefits you as a society, versus like raping and pillaging the city center to like basically you live in the muck. And that's kind of what we've experienced, whether it's in digital or like meat space. So it's very cool to see you doing that. I know you've been picking up a lot of traction. You've been getting some very interesting phone calls on the OpenSat side, and hopefully that, like you said, continues into the bull market, and it's the best year for you guys.
Dude, the momentum on OpenSats is I can sleep well at night because OpenSats, man. Like it's to me, it's I think people are going to look back on this stage of OpenSats and just be like, wow, like it turned into a fucking juggernaut for good. So I'm incredibly excited about OpenSats. To bring it back to the token part of Brian's question that I just didn't answer at all, like competing crypto tokens, like the way I look at all this shit is very simple. In a free market, in a proper free market, where there aren't legal tender laws, where they're saying you have to use this money, you have to trade it this way, you have to do this, here's, brutal tax regulation, all this other shit if you do Forex in a certain way or whatever. In a proper free market, monies compete against each other, and the best money will win. The hardest money will win. And Bitcoin is the hardest money ever in humanity. and it's going to win. I believe it's going to win. I crunched the numbers. I did my own research, and I believe it's going to win. And as a result, I have incredible conviction that shitcoins, crypto tokens, the US dollar, the euro, whatever BRICS comes out with in their future currency, gold, real estate as a store of value, are no competition to Bitcoin. And the market will prove that out over time. They are not a threat to Bitcoin. They're a threat to the users that speculate on them, right? So I don't pretend that, like if you have some new scam token that comes out, like absolutely, it can be a malicious scam token. And it's a threat to the users who decide to purchase it, thinking that they're going to get rich quick. But it's not a threat to Bitcoin. And so I sleep well at night on in that regard. I don't try and I mean, you will die a miserable life if for the rest of your life you try and call out all the scams and tokens and everything else in this space. It's much easier to just go into your Bitcoin Zen and realize it's not a threat to Bitcoin, and accept the unfortunate reality that people that don't want to accept personal responsibility will fall for get rich quick schemes forever.
Bitcoin Zen in 2024. It's a nice motto.
Stay humble,
Things could get
sets.
Yep, exactly.
Unless you're
Things could
following
get
Matt
crazy.
unless you're following Matt on NOSTR, then it seems
A little
like
less Zen.
the caps have come back. So that maybe there's
I'm not the caps doesn't mean I'm shouting. I'm just speaking clearly. That's all.
the caps are almost like the Kramer.
He's enunciating.
The caps are scary though, because they remind me of like the Kramer. They're like the reverse.
If
You
you're
start
not,
getting bullish, and then it all starts crumbling. You got sand.
well, I mean, it's easy for people to cherry pick. I've been bullish at every single Bitcoin top, but I've also been bullish on every single Bitcoin bottom. So
Consistent.
There's some
Nothing else.
yeah, very consistent.
Well, this has been awesome, Matt. I think being mindful of your time, we can probably wrap here. But super excited to get this pod off the ground. And again, couldn't think of anyone better than you to help us launch it. So appreciate it, man.
It was a fun rip. Appreciate you guys.
Yeah, appreciate you coming on. I think we're going to try to make the future ones nice and tight, but this one we felt we had to go for it and get Matt's background, some of the early stories, and then tying into what's happening now and what we're looking forward to. So appreciate everybody tuning in.
Yep, appreciate tuning in. See you guys in a couple weeks. Later.
Peace.